Really conscious of time, and need to give you just a small bit of time to ask any questions that you may have of the panel. I hope we've covered the set questions well enough. There's a questioner down there.
Hi, John McDonough from RecRaw Consulting, which is an employability and recruitment solutions business. For many years, there's been an acknowledgement by employers and providers, often privately, of the need to have some really effective psychological work done prior to skills training and not just a tick box exercise. In theory, this should be DWP funded for the unemployed, but effectiveness in this area is very, very varied. There's rarely enough money in skills budgets to do it well, and I've often found that the people who set the essay question, i.e. the specification on this stuff, can't answer it, which we heard in the last debate as well. For this to change, am I right in thinking that we are waiting for a sudden enlightenment in Whitehall policy and commercial departments to either enable or genuinely lead and incentivise the market to deliver what employers and many unemployed people need? And if so, how do we make that happen?
Well, I think it might also come back to different funding streams, and do the different funding streams follow on? I don't know if anybody deliver. You must deliver. Do you tend to have programs for the unemployed that lead to an apprenticeship, or do you tend to manage them as, that's not a leading question, but
we educate about 2,000 unemployed people a year across our coastal districts. The challenge is what is eligible for funding. It comes back to being almost forced to give a certain offer, because that's what the DWP want, because it believes it brings them positive outcomes. Broadly, we want to deliver an offer that's right for the people, that then gets them job sustainability. There's the short-term versus the long-term problem, which is, yes, we can get someone into a job for the short term, but does that give them a sustainable career? And that, for me, is the major challenge. I've not come across a DWP yet that would favour a longer programme that got someone a real technical skill versus a short, sharp CV building, literally a numeracy refresh bit of IT that gets them into a short-term job that gets a certain tick. So I think in terms of the way it should go forward, that there has to be the freedom to work to bring about local prosperity in an economic region. The devolvement issue, I think, is really, really important, because if all the partners in that area are working to bring prosperity to that region, then they will think about it more for the longer term. The problem with skills policy is it's so short term. Yeah. And it's about hitting short-term targets for short-term gain. We'll only know over time whether those short-term gains actually bring real life changes. My fear, unfortunately, as I said, having been here a long time, is it doesn't. And there needs to be a longer-term investment in people who want and require sustainable employment. So I think it's a massive challenge.
Thanks for that. There's a question in the second row.
Just going back to social inclusion and social mobility, we were talking about, it's both a suggestion and a question about budgets as a whole and the 10% handing over. If it was a devolved budget, you could defer that money into, say, organisations that were interested in social mobility's needs, that were involved in these situations. How and when can that happen to be able to devolve those budgets and that 10% into those organisations, perhaps those who have autistic societies, dyslexic societies, organisations that are within the local communities, such as mine, as Lambeth. We have various initiatives that are trying to kick off in SMEs and local situations. How can we devolve that budget into those situations?
The 10% transfer, lots of organisations, because it started with supply chain, I think people have missed the fact that you can transfer it to all sorts of organisations. I just wonder, someone like Lloyd's Bank, would you see that it might be a possible use of the funds to transfer it to organisations that have more of a social purpose as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when we look to decide who we are going to transfer it to, we'll probably go down that route, perhaps more than our supply chain. So we are looking at charities that we're working with to see, how we can share that money. Absolutely.
So I do think it'll be something that does happen.
I mean, I think you've made a really important point that I generally don't think that's understood enough yet. And I think, again, that's exactly where the government could be more, in a way, more helpfully interfering in terms of the website, in terms of the promotion around that, because I think there are lots of things that are actually quite good now that people haven't properly understood. And it's back to your point about the providers, how providers can really pick that up and work with employers to help unlock that.
I think it's a very important, the very important point that you've raised, and again, it goes back, I think, to what members of Parliament and other people who are decision makers in local areas see in their own territory. I still don't think, and I'm not blaming directly the government for this, although I think it was an indirect way, impact of the way in which they consolidated when they were outsourcing all sorts of activities into 4 or 5 big providers in the areas, the Sercos and everybody else that we know of, and of course we were all promised at the time, well they will, no they will, and I was worried in my area because I had 2 or 3 very small training providers who were very niche specific. They were niche specific for people with autism and things like that. And of course, most of those people never got a sniff. And so I think that was a loss. And I think we still underestimate, I say we, decision makers, policy makers nationally, we still underestimate the contribution that the third sector could make in these sorts of areas. The other thing I think which sort of links to that, and also goes back a little bit to the previous question as well, is I've talked about, and we've all talked about, the dynamics of change and all the rest of everything, and how people are going to have to juggle all these jobs and do this, that, and the other. We mustn't neglect the human element of this. People are not robots just to be fitted into these areas. The changes that you have to make, the flexibilities you have to make, cause tension, they cause stress, and there are great things about the digital world, but the ability of, dare I say, some, and particularly I think younger people who are very much of the digital world, to have some of that face-to-face encounter, some of that personal training and everything that goes with it. If we don't get that right, then all these other challenges will fall by the wayside because we won't get people developing in the way that they need to do and improving their skills. It won't be good for their life chances, but it also won't be good for our productivity.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And one big question that has been asked is around the recent sort of view that the IFA are reviewing rates, and the likelihood is a number of, we've only been going a year or two, and already the rates might be changing. Again, the principle of change, but the principle of whether funding rates might reduce quality, for example, just a very brief, and you can see the time, just to go around the panel, what's your view?
Well, in a very nutshell, I think, of course, if you drop funding, it's going to have an impact on quality. And there's nothing more to it than that. We know there's been some quite high-profile reviews in the last few weeks, and it seems almost impossible that the review of the bands isn't correlated with the kind of, oh my word, we had a 3 million target, or we're not going to meet that. Oh, hang on, they've only spent 8%, but actually we could overspend on this if everyone... The financial profile of this hasn't worked, and then that's now impacted now with these reviews and drops in funding bands that have huge implications on us as providers, and again on our employees and apprentices.
So I would say that the funding band reviews, if reductions are made, it will absolutely impact quality. What I would say, I've got certain feelings about the IFA at the moment, but that despite how I've been feeling over the last few weeks when I first found out about some of the reductions, so for example, project management has been reduced by 33%, or at least that's what's being proposed at the moment. In leadership and management, we've got between 18 and 30% reductions. So they're big reductions we're talking about here. I think despite what I feel about those reductions, what I would say is that the IFA have been asked to conduct this review by DfE at a really odd time, because how can we possibly know if the apprenticeships that we've been delivering are absolutely categorically delivering the value for money. I can tell you that as part of the employer review panels, we can tell you and we can provide evidence to show what our costing was, and we can show that measures around value for money, but we've not had any completers. So for example, in project management, not a single person has been through endpoint assessment, but IFA had to assess whether or not the programs being delivered were delivering value for money. That was a nigh on impossible task for the IFA to have conducted, and yet they've done it and have come up with reductions. So I don't understand how value for money could have been considered as part of a review, a formal review at this stage.
I get that. I understand that.
Yeah, so from an employer point of view, and I think it's the general theme, we want stability. And it's far too early to say whether an apprenticeship is working or not. You know, as you said, Mary, we haven't had people go through the endpoint assessment. We can't demonstrate what the return of investment is yet. We work very closely with all of our training providers to come up with a bespoke learner journey. And all that investment of time is then wasted if we've then got to go back to the drawing board and review it again.
Well, I sort of have this view that sort of cutting costs doesn't always result in lower quality, in the same way increasing rates doesn't always result in higher quality. That said, we all know that funding does tend to drive behaviour, and we do know that, you know, doing something now will squeeze that. And therefore, what I do think, and I think it's the point Mary was just making, that the IFA particularly, and government indeed, we need to get better at understanding the true value of delivery, and that whole, and make a proper assessment on that whole end-to-end. Because my worry is, a bit like the conversations earlier, the wrong things will get squeezed, and then that will impact on the quality, and then we'll be back down into that spiral.
I know I'm really conscious that I don't want to overspeak, but just one last point on that. So the product development team that I headed up 18 months ago, standards coming in, conversation was, here's the skills, knowledge and behaviour that we have to be able to deliver. Here's the funding band. How can we deliver that in the best possible quality? And that was the nature of the conversation that we'd be having with product managers. Now, funding band cut, you've got to go back to that same group of people. I've got to go back to them and go, what are we taking out? What we like, and that's my fear, right? That it becomes a race to the bottom in quality. So sorry, just to add to that.
And without, you know, making a judgment whether which of the funding is right, as a minimum, you will have two groups of people running through on two different programs, and that can't be right. That, you know, whatever the level was, if they got it wrong in the first place, and dare I say, I think there were some bands that were too high. But it doesn't really matter, because you're now going to have two groups of people going through with the same employer on two different programs, and that can't be right.
Yeah, just very quickly, time and research. We need time to bed these in so that we know and research exactly what the cost base is. But the other debate that I don't think has ever happened is, what's a fair margin for providers? Yes. No one's had that debate. They're not willing to have that debate, but actually we need to be having that debate, because it's a hidden thing. Providers need margin to survive and to grow and prosper. Without it, that won't happen, and providers will struggle financially. So we need to open that debate transparently.
Transparency, I think
yeah.
It's a very, because whatever the model is, however bad it is or good it is, we don't know what it is, and that can't be right. Exactly. Gordon, you got the last word.
I mean, just a couple of comments. I mean, the first one, you probably expect me to say this, but nevertheless, I'm going to say it. Where is this being driven from? That's the first question, I would say. Is it being driven from projections within the DFE for what they need to put forward for Hammond's budget in the autumn or whatever? Is it the internal process within the IFA where they're looking at things and saying, goodness me, we were too generous there and we weren't generous enough here? I don't know the answer to that. Nobody else does. But I think there is a broader issue here, and it's been picked up on by a couple of people at the moment. It's far too early to tell. It's far too early to tell. I mean, it's like sort of planting seedlings and saying, well, they don't look very good, we'll pull a few up and see what happened. There is a distinction, and I don't think it's always. I mean, we've moved on. I think in government and policy making from the days when the only things that mattered were input. I think we've now got a sense that we have to measure output as well, but output is not the same as outcome, and I think it's a matter for huge regret, frankly. And I know the people who used to form part of this body feel that as well. That we no longer have an independent body, which is what the UKCS was, which has the ability, if it should choose or be so asked to do the government, to look at some of those things in an impartial, and I'm not asking for, you know, a 5 or 10 year longitudinal study, but just something which people can then say, well, they've looked at this, they've looked at it from an relatively objective point of view, rather than it being either some issue in Ifate or some desperate running around to reduce funding to produce a few candle ends for the Treasury.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure there's more to be said, but it's a really interesting note to finish on, because it sort of wraps up the debate and the type of event we've had, which is, I think, what everybody wants is to flush out some of these issues. If we can get some independent views, who is independent, but you know what I mean, research and study about the impacts of these things, then that will be a real help. But for now, can I ask you to say thanks very much to the panel, particularly Gordon, who's given up his time in no doubt a very busy day. So perhaps a warm thank you for all of our panel.